So, Bruna, thank you for joining us. I know you have an extremely busy 6 months ahead of you leading up to COP30 in Belém, Brazil. Talking about Brazil, for those of us who've been working on sustainability for a very long time, you'll remember that in Rio, Brazil, that's when 154 nations came together and adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which effectively said that we have to start addressing the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It also happens to be 10 years since the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I thought it'd be helpful to have you remark on where we are, 10 years in our journey, the good and the bad. So, where are we?
All right. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It has been a real privilege and opportunity to hear and understand how the discussion is going in the region. And as I've heard several times here, the battle on climate change will be won or lost here. So it's really great that we can connect. And thank you for the opportunity to bring the road to COP30 here as well. As we reflect on the 10 years from the Paris Agreement, but also the 23rd years since the Rio Convention, in Rio we actually approved 3 UN conventions, the one on climate change, the one on biodiversity, and the one on desertification. So in the way that we're approaching COP, we very much want to also look at the synergies between these spaces and how we can make the best of them. But on the 10 years since the Paris Agreement that will be marked in Belém, I think two reflections. One is that on the success of the Paris Agreement, right? So, as we are in a very difficult geopolitical moment, and we've heard several times here over the past 2 days, I think we need to acknowledge the success of these first 10 years. And that is really important in terms of safeguarding the multilateralism space that we have. So, first of all, when we started the Paris Agreement, we were on a global trajectory to over 4 degrees Celsius of increase in temperature globally. And 10 years later, we have brought this down collectively and globally to 2.7 degrees. So, that has been success. The second thing is that we've been able to negotiate in a space that is all done by consensus, which is very hard. We've been able to negotiate each of the pieces of the Paris Agreement, including Article 6 finalizing last year. So that, again, is success of how we can come together to the table and make things happen. What we need now in terms of the challenge for the next years, which is what we're hoping to inaugurate in Belém, is to look at how we accelerate that last piece of the trajectory. So we need to be sharp, focused, and really bring our attention to the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. That's our challenge for Belém.
So, we've got to go faster and we have to implement. But you alluded to the multilateralism, and it happens to be 80 years since the end of World War II, when we really had an unprecedented stretch of global cooperation, globalization, and for the most part, a very peaceful era. But many would say there's a significant paradigm shift underway, and that multilateralism is crumbling. And we know the Paris Agreement went from 196 now to 195 countries, right, for the second time. So, what gives you a sense of optimism? Do we think that multilateralism is actually going to work?
I think it's the only way forward, right? What else can we do? So we do need to protect that space in which you're working together. Again, we've heard here several times, no one can do this alone. If we go down that pathway, it's a very dangerous pathway to all of us. And I think when you're talking about the US leaving the Paris Agreement, one, it is one out of 196 countries, so 195. We still have everyone else around the table, including countries like Argentina. So we've seen in the last months there was a watching mode to what was going to happen in the aftermath of that. And we've seen that everyone continues to be in the table. And that's very important that we continue on that path.
And actually, do you mind talking about a couple of weeks ago what your
Yeah.
president and UN Secretary General convened? Because that's a good example.
Yes, exactly. It's a good example. So, one of the things that we will need for Belém, one of the big tasks towards Belém, is that every country needs to come back to the table and present their climate plans, their NDCs, as well as their NAPs, their adaptation plans. This is a big part of the diplomatic effort. And President Lula and Guterres, the UN Secretary General, have been working together on mobilization of the several leaders around this. They've started on the G20 last year on the leaders summit, then the first round of this. And now, just last week, we've gathered the biggest emitters, but also leaders of the regional representation, so the African Union, ASEAN, all of these leaders were together and sent a very strong signal that they're still all very committed to that. I think the highlight of that is President Xi Jinping from China saying and confirming for the first time that China will come out with an NDC that is economy wide and that's including all of the gases. That is a very powerful political signal, and we hope that on the next months we'll see these NDCs coming in and we'll be able to show by Belém that everyone continues to be on the table.
That's great. So still staying committed despite the headwinds, and multilateralism is still, working. So Ecosperity, we're 11th year in, and we've gone from an event to an ecosystem of partners, and now we're trying to really leverage the platform as a springboard for action. You lead the action agenda for the COP30, not an easy undertaking, but you're trying to engage certainly investors, businesses, as well as civil society and the non-state government actors as well. So what's different this time about the new architecture that you're trying to bring with the action agenda?
Yes, and thank you for that. And that is a big part of why I'm here, trying to get everyone very excited about the actual implementation, the action agenda, the things that happen also outside of the negotiations. So I think a big challenge as we looked into the first 10 years of the Paris Agreement from a negotiations perspective, we also look at it from the action agenda perspective. When Paris was signed, one of the things that was created was this space for the non-party stakeholders, meaning businesses, investors, subnational governments, that is called the Global Climate Action Agenda. There's been established a role of the high-level champions, and they are supposed to be mobilizing these communities, supposed to be joining them up with the parties, with the countries on how we can move together on that. And it's been, again, a very successful first 10 years in terms of bringing everyone in. So if we remember everyone who was in Paris, the size of the COPs and how much in the blue zone, in the negotiation zone, we had the private sector's the investments, it was a much lower scale than what we have today. We have brought these stakeholders in. There's been several commitments on the Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, GFENS, over 475 collaboration initiatives globally of the action agenda. And now, looking into the future, I think we have identified mainly two challenges that we will need to tackle and that we want to build together the vision for the next 5 and 10 years. One is how are we actually tracking and monitoring and creating the transparency space for what has been promised, right? We've had several promises. It is time to deliver. So we need to focus, instead of launching every year a lot of new initiatives and really creating the space to bring attention to everyone who is committing, we need to be paying attention to what has happened with those commitments that have been made over the last 10 years. How are we delivering results? How are we delivering mobilized finance, hectares protected, gigawatts added to the renewable space? So that is one big challenge. The second big challenge is how do we connect much more this into the implementation phase of what's coming out of the negotiations. So they have been running in parallel tracks. We want to create a framework that supports and responds to what has come out of the negotiations. And the logic of that is that in Dubai, we have all looked into how are we in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we have come out with the outcomes of the global stock take. It's a very clear pathway to what we need to do. We need to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, transition away from fossil fuels, protect and restore nature by 2030, but also create more resilient agriculture, health resilience, social protection. There are a number of things, finance, mobilize it much faster and in much larger scale, build capacity and technology transfer. Those things are a very clear roadmap to what we need to do. So we're hoping to build a framework of the action agenda that guides and focuses all of the existing initiatives towards those results. Create KPIs that we can follow, that we can track, and that every year we can monitor how we are advancing in that term. Bring all of the stakeholders to the table, and instead of focusing on creating several new initiatives that Brazil is putting on the table, invite those stakeholders to tell us how are they going to deliver these results at this COP. So we're hoping in terms of next steps to be able to put this framework to public by June, so by the meeting of the mid-year of the negotiations, and then work throughout the rest of the year to be in places like this and actually identify those things that we can showcase at COP as results. One of the other things that we want to do as well is to build banks of solutions. And we've seen here, throughout the days as well, those really solutions that already exist. And we've learned and we've heard a lot about that as well. All of the solutions, or most of the solutions that we need, are already there.
They're available.
What we need to do is focus on how do we get them to scale up? How do we bring the cost curves down faster? And that's what we need to identify on where we need to collectively work on. And we hope that the action agenda can be a framework that can service that in a more fit for purpose way. So invite you all to tell us, what do you think would be useful in that sense? How do we use that framework to bring us all together?
Yeah. So it's music to our ears in that it's very aligned with the vision that we have with Ecosperity in terms of stock taking for Asia 2030. And then having very clear systems level levers, as we heard yesterday, and having the very concrete set of decarbonization roadmaps, and hopefully being able to keep ourselves accountable in terms of the progress that we're making every year. So stay tuned. Next year, we'll see where we are in terms of our contribution. And you taught me a word. I keep on looking at this so I can pronounce it correctly when we were catching up yesterday, which is an indigenous word called muchirao. Hopefully, I got that right, which means global action for a common purpose. And that really resonates. So I will not forget that word, even though I may not be able to pronounce it 100% correctly. So we are at a financing event, so we have to talk about financing, which is the cross-cutting enabler. And there's something called the new collective quantified goal on climate finance that came out of Baku last year, 1.3 trillion per annum by 2035, right? And it was hard to do, trying to get 100 billion, but we now got to do 1.3 trillion for the developing markets. Okay. So tell us about what are you going to do, leveraging COP30 to be able to get there and really be able to mobilize that, given the heavy lift that we have and many of the DFIs, and we heard a bit about it, the infrastructure discussion, fiscally more challenged.
Yes. And I think we have to come from a place, first of all, well done on the pronunciation of Muchiro. And we will end on that note because you're all a part of the Muchiro. If there's one thing that you need to come out of here today, that's it. We're all part of the Muchiro. So on the finance roadmap, we need to acknowledge the difficult space that we are in. And I think that, again, in Baku last year, it was very frustrating for a lot of the developing countries that that number wasn't higher, and that was the expectation. But it was the agreement that was possible, and we need to work on that. So the agreement was that 300 billion would be the tranche that per year that developed countries would lead on mobilizing for developing countries, but with the aim to get to 1.3 trillion, including in mobilizing private investments. The task that we have until Belém is to come up with a plan, a roadmap to how do we get to 1.3 trillion over time until 2035. And we're doing that in two ways. One is the regular negotiating track, and there has been a process where we've asked everyone to tell us what they think should be a part of that roadmap. But the second track of it is a very Brazilian type of innovation. We have created as part of COPs something that we're calling the circles. The circles are about engaging stakeholders that are usually not a part of the climate conventions. And one of these circles will be the circle of ministers of finance. We want to bring them in a much more strong way. And this has been inspired by what we've done with the G20 that Brazil has hosted last year, bringing finance ministers, climate ministers, and central banks together to think together of what needs to be done. So the logic of the circle of the finance ministers, which is led by our own finance minister, Haddad, is that we will look at 5 topics of discussions throughout the year. And this has already started with the IMF forum in Washington. And we're hoping that throughout the year, we'll have several moments of discussions, including with the partners of GFANs and EECS that are supporting this process. So it will be 5 things that they will focus on in terms of providing inputs into the roadmap. 3 of them are about staggering the different types of capitals, and we've heard here a lot about that as well. The first is the reform of the multilateral banks and how they can increase the lending capacity that they have to support this transition. So focusing again on something that is not in the mandate of the UNFCCC, but that is crucial for us to be able to achieve those results. So how do we advance on that? The second is concessional capital, including the climate funds. So it's about one, looking at new sources of concessional capital that we can bring to the table. And this is the discussion about solidarity levies, about new forms of taxation that are innovative, that can bring new money to the table, but also about how we simplify access to the climate funds that are a crucial piece of that puzzle. The third is developing innovative financial instruments for private sector finance mobilization. And these are things like instruments. Brazil is creating the Tropical Forest Forever facility, or trying to mobilize around that towards COP. If you have not yet heard about it, please come to me. We're keen to, by COP30, be able to bring some money to the table, both in a tranche of concessional and in a tranche of private funds. That is a revolving fund to pay for standing forests, which is something that is innovative and that we need, but something that doesn't require continuous donation capital, but that mobilizes private. But also looking into de-risking mechanisms that a lot have been talked about here, or reallocation of risks, as you've said as well, like guarantees, hedging. How can we put these things in place in a way that supports the mobilization? The fourth and the fifth parts of the discussion are about creating the environment. So for us is the country platforms that we have also talked about in the G20, but how do you translate the NDCs that the countries are doing into practical investment plans and show for those international markets that don't really know where to invest, where are the opportunities, the countries are able to show where those opportunities are and aggregate some of those risk allocation instruments that can support that capital arriving at the country. Brazil itself has done its Brazil investment platform, and it's been really interesting to see the different model, but also that has a lot to inspire us of the fast piece here in Asia. The last one, which you also heard about, I think, in a panel earlier today, is the regulatory frameworks. So how do we harmonize taxonomies? How do we harmonize regulations across countries on sustainable finance in a way that is supportive of that process, including looking at Basel, those types of structures, and how we incorporate the climate risks into the long-term risks that we have for economic stability?
So very comprehensive, and glad to hear about forest, given it's very relevant to this region as well. I'm conscious of time, but one more word that I learned, given Brazil is a football nation, is virada, which means that even though you may be at the time in the soccer match losing, you can actually turn the tide and ultimately win. And it felt very appropriate to actually end on that virada note, which is, even though it feels like a very large gap in terms of where we need to get to for 2030, the size of the prize is even greater than the costs that is entailed for taking action. And so the time is now, and you've emphasized the importance of working together collaboratively and leveraging all systems. And hence why the theme is Race Towards 2030, All Systems Go. So thank you for joining us today. And I also want to thank you to all the sponsors as well as the event partners. We, in fact, have a record year. 28 event partners. I know it felt at times you had to double task or go from one venue to the other, but it goes to show how much people really want to collaborate and really take action. And we've had over 4,000 participants, both online as well as in person, including many internationally, really interested in what's going on in this region in Asia. So there's a lot more room and opportunity for us to collaborate. So on that note, thank you. The time to act now, and let's act together. Thank you.
Thank you.